So welcome to the Tashkeel Lecture. My name is Hiba Farhad. I'm the Professional Practice Coordinator at Tashkeel, and my colleague Salim, who is the Senior Design Coordinator at Tashkeel as well. The Tashkeel Lecture series features inspiring practitioners and professionals working at the forefront of international visual art and design. It seeks to highlight technical innovation, shine a spotlight on pioneering practices, and provide important insights. Today, we welcome Chris Lefteri, an accomplished designer and internationally recognized authority on materials and their application in design. His books include Materials for Design and 6 other titles in the Materials for Inspirational Design series. The work of his studio and publications have been pivotal in changing the way designers and the materials industry consider materials. His studio is widely recognized as one of the leading studios working in the field of materials and CMF. In 2018, he launched FixIts, his first materials-driven product. The title of Chris's lecture is From Material Values to Product Application. Chris will take us through a different approach to the design process, one that starts with materials and not sketches. He will show us how discovering new and interesting materials will help designers ask critical questions that will in turn prompt a totally different kind of design. Just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. Please keep your microphone on mute during the lecture. Feel free to type your comments and questions in the chat zone, or you can save them up for the Q&A session with Chris at the end. Please note that this session is being recorded. And finally, please welcome Chris. And Chris, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Lovely to be with you all on this cloudy, cold London afternoon. I will give an introduction to myself a little bit later in the slides, but I want to start with this question, which is, what is it you want your material to be? And if I were to sum up the talk in one idea that I want to leave you with, it is this, that traditional design process, and I separate design from craft, but in any form of design, whether that's architectural or interior or furniture or product, we start with designing shapes, we start with designing form, and then we go through this process of development and refining. And then if we're designing things particularly made out of plastic or metal, we will then think about that material once the design is completed. And that one thing that I want to leave you with today is, what if you don't start with a sketch? What if you start with a material? And the title, Asking Your Materials What They Want to Be, was inspired by a quote from Louis Kahn, the mid-century US architect, who, when he was lecturing his students, would say to them, if they got stuck, ask your material, ask your brick what it wants to be. And I love this idea that you have this dialogue with the material. And I see materials as being characters, and I see materials as being characters in stories, because we as consumers buy stories. You know, we own products. The reason we own those particular products from those specific brands is because we buy stories. And although it's not obvious, I think the materials are very much a part of these stories. And if you really want to fulfill the value the materials can bring, then you need to put them at the beginning of the design process, rather than that traditional methodology which puts them at the end of the design process. So there are, I think, 5 chapters in my talk today, and I'll uncover some ideas around materials and how to use them better and how to extract the meaning, how we separate the different values that materials offer, and trying to understand what materials mean and how we can, break that meaning down into several parts, and obviously deal with sustainability. First thing I want to let's just get the cursor in the right place. First thing I want to deal with is this connection between a material as a starting point and the method you use to convert that material into an object, an item, a product. And I use that word product in its very broadest terms. And you can't separate those materials from the process, because I can take any number of materials and I can take a simple shape like a bowl and interpret that bowl in multiple ways by applying a different material. So I can start with one material, and in this case, I won't say the top left. I'll come back to one in a minute. Or we can take the center one, which is fibers. We can take steel. We can take glass. We can take spun steel. We can take ceramics. And just through the selection of that material in this very simple object, that material will have a different form to any other type of process, because there is a natural evolution of materials and the processes that we use to form them that has developed over centuries or thousands of years in some cases, that just fit. I mean, the material fits naturally with this method of production. It would be very hard, for example, to make the one that's at the top left with the process that's at the bottom right. And so we've evolved this understanding of materials had to be processed in a certain way. That in itself starts to build the process and can begin the process of abducting a material and applying a different process. If I just take one image, if I take one material, for example, sorry, I've skipped a slide. If I take one material, in this case, paper, I can interpret paper in three, and I've just picked three, but there are a multitude of different forms that I can arrive at just by manipulating one material in different ways. So there is, before you even start to design and sketch anything, just think about how you can make a material in different ways. And this idea is, is very close to how craft works, not so much in design, but I think has as much value for designers as it does for craft. The other things that I think are really important takeaways from this are the experiences the materials bring. And I've got two examples of that. One is this Range Rover Velar, which I think is one of the best examples of a car interior using materials to indulge the passengers, the drivers of a car. And if you go inside the car and if you look at just one, let's say, zone, and let's look at the door, the interior door panel, there's like 16 different materials here. And it's a wonderful exploration of sensory, functional, audible experiences, from the different fabrics that I've got with leather and that woven fabric, with the speaker grill, with that geometric perforation, with the cold cast magnesium at the door handle, this wonderful sense of indulgement in materials and sensoriality. And this is what materials can bring. The next slide that I want to talk about in terms of materials is how they make us feel. So if the Range Rover was a way of making you feel very indulged and luxurious, this UE Mega Boom from UE is I think a great example of textiles, and this particular collection of Ultimate Ears speakers pioneered the use of textiles in electronics. And if you look at electronics, one of the big growth areas is in textiles, because they humanize technology. They change the way we perceive the product, in this case as a speaker. When I look at that speaker, what I see is an excuse to have fun, because of the fact that it's made out of this fabric with beautiful colors and soft rubbery grips, makes me want to take it out of my home, makes me want to take it onto the beach, makes me want to have fun, because it does all sorts of things that I can never do before. And that's because of the materials. This is a color materials and finish, or CMF experience. So that's the value of materials, to create experiences. And by understanding the way that you process materials, I think is the first start to exploring that. So let's move on. So I said that I would explain a little bit of my background. So I'm in London. That's where my studio is based. I have an office that's also in South Korea, in Seoul. And I started as an industrial designer at the Royal College in London. And I started studying, practicing industrial design like anybody else in any college anywhere in the world. But I was quite interested in what things were made from, and I had this idea that nobody had really discussed materials or how things were made. And I was just curious to find out. And I was very lucky that I was lecturing at Central St. Martin's in London at the same time. And I was very lucky that I was introduced to a publisher who basically had this vision for a book on materials for designers. And I presented my idea and my pitch. And it was not something I'd ever had any experience of before. I'd never written a book. I'd never come close to writing a book. I'd never had any aspirations to write a book. But I really was enthusiastic and very passionate about what this book could be. And this was in 1999. The first book came out in 2000. Sorry, I beg your pardon, 2001. Last year was the 20th anniversary. And it was on plastics because the publisher felt that actually we should break it down into a series of books. So over a period of about 15 years, I wrote lots of books on different types of materials and then ultimately how things were made, production processes used in materials. And then they were translated into different languages. And over a period of maybe 6-7 years, I started to become known as somebody who's a materials expert. And it took a long time. It took several books. I thought, hey, I've written a book on plastics. I'm going to be like Mr. Plastics. It didn't happen. It took lots and lots of books for that to happen. So as I was lecturing, I started to decrease the amount of lecturing that I was doing and started to build the studio. It's a very small studio. There's only 8 of us in total, very small, but very specialized in this world of materials. And we work across these different industries, car brands, electronics brands, retailers, always putting materials in front of designers that they haven't seen before in the hope that we inspire new applications. And the studio has grown from just a material studio into a color materials and finish, so CMF, which is a big area of design. And that area, we connect 3 different things. We connect the world of materials with the world of trends, with the world of industrial design. And I'd say that we're quite unique in that respect because you have lots of industrial design studios. You have lots of trend agencies who deal with color materials and trends. And you have lots of engineers who deal with materials. But actually, this area of crossing those 3, I think, makes us quite unique. And as you can imagine, the studio is filled with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands of samples, which we collect, and always collecting. It's quite unusual that we have a project where, we have the samples in the office. We always have to research and have to collect more samples, but it's really hands-on. It's quite fun because these packages arrive and, you unwrap them and you've got these amazing samples that you touch and you feel and you prod and you poke and you kind of investigate. And that leads the whole journey of designing. As you said at the beginning, the 2018, I launched FixIts, which is the first brand product actually that I launched myself, completely under a different name. The 2, Lefteri Design and FixIts, are not connected, other than they share the same office space. And obviously, I work on the two companies. And FixIts was based on a material that I had discovered in my first book, and I had used many times when I was doing student workshops. And it was a material that actually I would take on holiday because I would use it to repair things. And it was based on just granules. I'd have a bag of white granules, and I would take them and repair things if I needed to repair something on holiday, or I'd keep some in my kitchen drawer. And my wife said, you should turn this into a product. So I developed a brand, which is called FixIts, and then the shape of these sticks. So you put the sticks in hot water, they become soft and become malleable, and you can repair something. And when it becomes hard, um, when it becomes room temperature, it becomes hard. And you can repeat that process, putting it back in the hot water, becomes soft, it goes hard again, and it can be recycled. So it's kind of fun. It's actually a material story, this project. It's because it's about communicating the value of a material. But going back to this philosophy of materials first. So this is the diagram that sums it up, because as designers, this is how we're taught, this is how we're trained. You have a problem, you have a design, and then you think about the materials. But what we don't think about is what happens if you put the materials at the beginning of that process. What I'm finding more and more is not even as the first step, but even starting with the material and saying, I found a material, what problem can this material solve? And letting that exploration, unfold. And it's very difficult. It isn't easy because we're not taught how to think in that way. We're taught how to draw something and then make something. We're not taught how to investigate an issue through the materials. So it is a challenge. And there are several philosophies that we follow in the studio. That's one philosophy. So when we're working with clients, it is about putting those materials in front of them for, let's say, a future car interior, or what does a brand represent in terms of its materials, and putting those materials in front of the designers before they've designed it. Because once they've designed it, it's too late, actually, for all sorts of commercial reasons. And the second rule that we follow is this, that because when we're working for clients, we have to present newness and originality. It's quite a challenge to do that for a company that wants to commercialize a material in the next 2 or 3 years. And 2 or 3 years is kind of like the now part. We're not talking about 5 years when it's future concepts. It takes 2 or 3 years to commercialize an existing material. So we have to kind of manage what this word new means. And I think it's also something to bear in mind, because new doesn't have to be always finding new materials. It can be about using materials in new ways. So I showed you those slides of the bowl. I mean, and there's a slide that I'll show you in a second of one of those materials being used in a completely new way because you change the way that it's processed. You take a piece of plastic, for example, and you process it in a way that you might make ceramic, or you take a piece of metal and you process it in a way that you might produce something out of plastic. And through that, bringing together of existing material and new process, you have something that is new. The second one is to actually change context. So to use an existing material in a new place. And there are examples of that will come up. But for example, I can take a material that was used in dairy farming and use that in a running shoe. And by that, reappropriation, recontextualizing of a material, I have something that can be very new. And then the third one, which is the ultimate, if you can find a new material and apply it in a new way, in a new place, then it's amazing. And that's kind of like the top level. That's where the most exciting innovations happen. This is an example of that. This is from Carnegie Mellon University for repairing materials that actually self-repair in a sense. And this we can say is a new material. This is an incredible opportunity, right? And the fun part is to do projects where you can say, all right, let me see what that can be. Because a lot of the science research that comes out is looking for these kinds of homes for these characters, these materials, and actually thinking where that can be, other than just this demonstrator. This is another example of that self-healing phenomenon. And what we have to do in the studio is to build stories. So we have to present information around sensoriality, because we have to say to the client, here is a material that feels beautiful, that it has a fantastic opportunity in terms of, reducing carbon emissions for a company, or that it has a great potential to save weight and feel really amazing in somebody's hand. This particular sample is injection molded metal, which is quite a challenge in terms of injection molding steel because it has a very high temperature. So we have to build a story of value around that for our clients. So we kind of categorize the materials onto different attributes that are valuable for a designer. So what it does, what its advantages are, how you can finish it, how you can process it, who the supplier is, whether it's a now, tomorrow, or future opportunity, and then actually applying that in terms of visuals and surface finishes and patterns, what that means, and then applying that to a concept. In this case, this is a mobile phone that uses injection molded steel for the back of a phone. So that's kind of the philosophy of the studio. Now let's move on to chapter 3. So ask your material how it wants to be formed. So I started off talking about example of why it's important with the bowl. If you understand the rules of materials, if you understand how they can be formed, you can apply those rules and you can break those rules. And this is, one of the most inspiring uses of a material. And it's so simple and it's so beautifully elegant in how it transforms a super simple material through a relatively simple process. And if you haven't seen these products before, it's called Air Vase by Tofu Architects. I'm going to show you a little video clip, and I'd like you to try and guess, without looking it up on Google, what you think the material is. And then I'll tell you. So here's the video clip. I'll just let that play out in the background. So you have this beautiful transformation of a flat piece of material into something that has so much character, that it has tension, that it has springiness, that it has bounce. It has something you could describe as shape memory because it kind of returns to its shape. It almost changes color as well when you look at it from different angles. And if you hadn't worked it out, if you hadn't seen this product, it is actually a piece of paper. It's a piece of paper that is a standard piece of paper. It has nothing clever about it at all. But because it's been cut to such fine lines, though the thin bits of paper act in a very different way, and it doesn't kind of crease, for example. I mean, it will, obviously it will tear and it will crease if I, put too much pressure on it. But it has such an amazing transformation from something that is essentially the same piece of paper that you might put into a photocopier machine, just because of the way that it's been processed. So ask your material what it wants to be, because it can be this incredible thing if you discover this incredible thing. The next one is a more commercial example. This is a pair of running shoes, and running shoes are fantastic. I mean, they have the most inspiring types of materials and process innovations and trends, and, just fantastic. This is designed by Alexander Taylor, UK-based designer for Adidas, that is using a completely different way to make a shoe upper. Usually when you make a shoe upper, you take a piece of fabric and you cut it into this type of shape, and then this gets formed around the sole, and and then you put the laces in between those holes, and that's what you have. That's how you construct your shoe. What he's done, though, is taken a process that is called fiber placement, and which works a little bit like a sewing machine. And what it does is it places fibers in particular areas of the shoe which need the most strength. So, for example, where your toes are needs more strength than, let's say, the bit where your the top part of your foot is, because there's a lot of flexing where your toes are, a lot of give. So knitting a shoe in this way and controlling the density of the fabric based on where you need the most amount of fabric, or fibers, I should say, completely changes what you can do with a shoe, not only in terms of the way it looks, but also in terms of its functionality in reducing lightweight, because I don't need the same density of fibers all over the shoe. The next one is a designer called Oscar Zita, who I featured in one of my books on metal. And I talked about reappropriating a material into a new process. This is a stool that he designed. He did a series of pieces of furniture where he had welded two pieces of steel together, and you can see the weld lines around the outside of this shape. He then connects it to a compressor and then passes air through. So you have the same process as inflating a piece of PVC plastic, but applied to metal. So the visual language of the metal is closer to a piece of plastic, and it's a completely different way of making something out of steel. I mean, it's actually incredibly hard, because steel is a very, very hard material to do. But it is an exploration in what happens if you bring together inappropriate processes. In a way, I used to describe these kinds of things as materials behaving badly, because they were not really meant to do things like this, and it contradicts what steel should be doing. It shouldn't, you shouldn't have to kind of work it that hard, but it's fun. This is moving to sort of very future and more complex ideas of materials and processes. So from paper, which is a very simple interpretation, through to these final pieces in this section are from MIT's Self-Assembly Lab. And I would look up the Self-Assembly Lab, because it is phenomenally inspiring, and it is all about materials that self-assemble using different methods, different processes. And I was really lucky. I met somebody who was teaching at a school in Switzerland who was actually, very much a part of the Self-Assembly Lab. And several weeks after I met him, he was going back to Boston. He invited me to have a look around, and he showed me this sample, which was one of the early experiments that they did, where it is just a series of fragments that through shaking you see self-assemble. And I just thought this was fantastic, just phenomenal discovery and experimentation in terms of how materials can be processed in a way that is letting them do the process. That was a very early test. They then went on to much more complex pieces using fabrics and 3D printing processes. I'll show you the next clip, which is about this. And again, it uses the natural property of a material, in this case, a flexing type of fabric like lycra, and being able to control that flexing through restricting its movement. So let's move on to that one. what you're seeing there is a piece of lycra that's been stretched, and while it's being held in that tension, there is a plotting machine which is printing an elastomeric material which doesn't stretch onto the lycra. When you release the tension of the lycra, then that tension wants to form into what you see there, which is a shoe upper. And again, a completely different way of processing a fabric. The last one in this section of self-forming, or I should say materials forming themselves, or understanding how forming processes and materials can bring about innovation, is an example from a designer called Surat Babu, who graduated from the Royal College of Art several years ago. And I was at his degree show and I saw him, explaining this, and it just blew me away. People ask me sometimes, what's my favorite material? It's a really difficult question to ask because it's not about the material, it's about how people use a material. And what he's done here is, through a single material, created something that has a really outstanding magical effect. So what you see there is based on a single material. It's not anything, it's not sort of programmed. It doesn't use any kind of high-tech electronics. It is just a piece of rubber. What you don't see inside is a rubber with a slightly different density. But to have this kind of geometry that appears just through stretching, and the way that it's been processed, I think is just so inspiring. So inspiring that it just makes me think, let's just stop inventing new materials and just try and create with what we have already. So the next chapter is, does your material have a story to tell? So storytelling and materials go hand in hand. Like I said, we as consumers, we consume stories. This is an early example of a story. This is from one of the earliest uses of aluminium. Aluminium was commercialized at the first half of the last century. And at the time, it was so valuable that supposedly Emperor Napoleon had cutlery made from aluminium because it had higher value than silver. And what I like about this very early story is that it explains on the packaging the value of this material in relation to a comb. And sorry, it's a little bit too small for me to read, but the way that it talks about it as being the kind of noble material, and actually that its springiness of these very thin comb parts means it retains its stiffness, it doesn't break. And it creates this wonderful, compelling story of why aluminium is better than traditional materials for comb. If you look at let's say 50 years on, the 1950s, where there was this explosion in materials, largely to do with the Second World War, and probably the most exciting time in material innovation in different classes of materials, from plastics to ceramics to metals. It was the height of material innovation and science. And the reason that I picked this in terms of materials and stories is because the image on the right, which shows the housewife and then the scientist behind her with what is actually a missile nose cone, is a story, because the technology for this material, which is a glass ceramic, and the company that pioneered this is called Corning, and this is called Corning glass ceramic, was based on the idea, came out of research into the military, that where they needed to launch missiles in, let's say, cold places, snow-covered places, and very quickly, as they were propelling through the atmosphere, would get very, very hot. And normal materials would crack, they would fracture because of that extreme thermal shock. This material was developed to stop that thermal shock in missile nose cones. Corning had this idea to use that into some consumer products, And this is the story to say it's a technology transfer from the military, well, not necessarily the military, yes, military, I mean, it's clearly a missile, and there's value for consumers in cookware because they used it in this cookware because you could put food in the freezer, pre-cooked, take it out from the freezer, stick it straight into the oven, and it wouldn't break, nothing would happen to it. So a fantastic story. The next one we're getting from the 1950s is Tupperware. So if you're not familiar with Tupperware, it was developed by a man called Earl Tupper. I think, again, there was this great opportunity to make food containers out of this material called polyethylene that he was using. The value of the polyethylene was that because it's a very soft, springy material, when you put the lid on your food container, you could push the lid down, it would expel a certain amount of air, and because there was a semi-vacuum, you would have food that would keep fresh for longer. And a very hard story to tell on a supermarket shelf. It was kind of failing until he came up with the idea of a different type of story, which was, rather than having these static objects stacked on a shelf, we need people to explain to consumers how it works and why it's good. So he found housewives, and they would go to different, houses, their friends' houses. They would have tea and they'd have some cake. And you had the birth of something called the Tupperware Party. And the purpose of the Tupperware Party was just to tell a story. So this lady would tell her story to her friends about the value of the Tupperware and how it's good and how it keeps your food fresh for longer. You can take food on the move with you, doesn't break. And it became this phenomenal story. I don't know if Tupperware parties in the US still continue. In the UK, they stopped maybe 15 years ago. So you have this huge, time span of this party, this storytelling exercise based around materials. The other thing that I think is really interesting about this case study is that they exploited many different aspects of the material, one of which was the sound, because you've expelled the air by pushing the lid down. When you peel the lid open, there is this suck of air back in there. And that suck of air makes a sound, and they call it the Tupperware burp. So you had a story that came out of the sound of a material. Now, how many times does anybody make a design decision based around the sound of a material? So phenomenal. If I can bring that up to date, we, as I said, are surrounded by stories. The biggest story, you can call it marketing if you want. One of the biggest stories, trends, is around artisan. Now, I can unpick this word artisan and trace it back to why we're obsessed with this word artisan. Partly because we want things that are local, that are handmade, because we value things that don't come from factories in Asia getting shipped all the way across the world. We value these local things, and we value something that is made for us. I can see it in food, I can see it in coffees, and I can see the whole kind of wave of baristas and making coffee as a big part of that story. That also then feeds down into stories around materials. And this is our biggest area of storytelling at the moment for materials, sustainability. This is, and there are many, many vegan leathers. There are leathers that are made from apples. There are leathers made from pineapples. This one is made from grape skins. And it's a story. You have to understand the story in order to value the product, because there is nothing about that looks like a grape. There's nothing that would tell you where that came from. But, tell me that I've got a shoe made from grape skins. That's a fantastic thing. I want to own that just because of what it's made from. What you see increasingly is brands developing their own materials. This is a watch that came out from Swatch late last year, I think, and they developed a material they call bioceramic, which is somehow linking plastics with ceramics. Now, again, if I see this, it doesn't feel like a ceramic, it feels more like a plastic, but I have to know that story in order to value it. So storytelling in materials is really important. And if we really want to exploit storytelling, we have to kind of understand what attributes make to us create a story. And if I say, this is a diagram, another one of the rules that we look at, is that if we're building a brand and putting materials at the heart of that, we value as consumers that experience, right? So the experience of driving, let's say, a BMW versus, you know, a cheaper brand. And that experience in terms of materials comes from three things. It comes from its function, it comes from how it makes us feel, and it comes from the sensory aspect. So if I break that down a little bit, so sensory means, is it cold? Is it soft? Is it hard? Is it warm? Is it you know, cool to the touch? Is it, in this case, a chair that you just want to smother yourself in because it feels so cozy, so soft and inviting, right? This is a sensory experience. This is, I picked a quite an extreme example of a sensory experience. If we look at emotional, it's the hardest one to kind of break down, because emotional is about how it makes us feel. I talked about the Volvo, not the Volvo, the Velar, and how that makes you feel when you're a passenger in that car. This is probably an icon in terms of materials design and actually taking a material and applying it in a new way, and change the way that we felt about computing. And computing was before that a gray beige box that you didn't want to have on a table. This made computing fun. This made computing absolutely something that I wanted to decorate my home with, to have on a table as a symbol of, you know, trend. And it makes me feel better, you know. Functionality is purely about how it works and making it better for us. So for example, if I want to have a piece of furniture that's lightweight because I want to carry it around with me, take it on picnics, that's functionality. Or this, which is the Adidas Boost, made from a material, and I'm talking about the white midsole there, that popcorn-like material, that is called Infinity. And I told you earlier about reappropriating materials and taking them out of dairy farming and using it in a completely different application. This is that material. The foam material that you see there was developed for cows to make them produce more milk. Because if cows are comfortable, they will make more milk. Cows traditionally will sit on concrete that can easily be cleaned, it can be hosed down, can be brushed, sterilized, but it's hard. This development was made to be durable, so the cows couldn't break it with their hooves. It was chemical resistant, so you could hose it down. It was water resistant, so it didn't have cause any problems with the water. And somebody at Adidas found this material and said, we could use this in a running shoe. And actually, one of the other advantages it has very good bounce. So if you use bounce in a running shoe, what does it do? It makes you run faster. It is a functional benefit of the shoe that makes you run faster. Now, I've broken this down into three different categories: functional, emotional, and sensory. I can fine tune those three attributes depending on what I want as my main story, because I can also say, well, this actually feels comfortable, so it's to do with sensory because it's more cushioning on my feet. I can make it say it's emotional because it makes me feel better. It makes me feel like I'm a faster athlete. If I start laying over a different material, which is the parley fabric, which is the fabric that's reclaimed ocean waste for the upper part of the shoe, then the most important part for this becomes the feeling, because I feel much better about the environment. It's no longer about functionality or about comfort. It's about feeling better about the environment. So being able to fine tune the value of materials, I think, is really important, and understanding how to break it down. So next chapter, how good for the environment is your materials? So you have to now be very, very thoughtful and detailed and very clever at trying to work through this incredibly complex world of sustainability. And in the last, I'd say 2 to 3 years, this has become the dominant question from clients in terms of work that we're doing. And being able to navigate what is a world changing so quickly in terms of what is right, what is wrong, or what is appropriate is really, really challenging, because no one really knows. It used to be You could have a biomaterial, or you could have a compostable material or recyclable material. But actually, it's changing, and the language is changing. We don't talk about recyclability; we talk about rejuvenating materials now. For example, you can't say that cotton is better than plastic. You would assume that maybe it is, because plastic is such a bad thing. But there was a campaign in Denmark that by a brand that wanted to use cotton tote bags to replace plastic bags. Obviously, the idea being that if I just use one bag and not get a plastic bag every time I go to the supermarket, then it's much better for the environment. But what somebody researched was that I would have to use my cotton tote bag 7,100 times for it to be more environmentally friendly than a plastic shopping bag. That's partly because of the amount of carbon emissions from what is a very small weight in plastic versus cotton. And cotton is one of the most polluting. It is the second most damaging, environmentally damaging crops in the world, because of pesticides, because of water, because of pollution from the chemicals that go into the growing of cotton. So yes, we should ask our materials what they want to be, but we have to also be very careful about knowing what's right and what's wrong, and not making the wrong kind of decision. But we can see this again in stories. So BMW, which is one of the first electric cars to mass popular, I guess, used a whole range of very interesting stories, from the olive tanning process for the leather, through to woods without varnishing, to micro suedes that were made from recycled plastic bottles for the fabrics, and really celebrating that story. This is another brand, which is House of Marley, that make electronics, and quite bold in using recycled materials. This is I think made from recycled garments, or maybe it's the top bit that is made from a mixture of wood, fiber, and plastics, as is the bottom, which is cork. And this is becoming more important as part of the brand story. You can see it in phone cases. This is a phone case from Google that uses recycled plastic bottles, and then woven into a fiber to make these, quite beautiful speckled effect phone cases, through to swimming goggles. And this one is one of my favorite, because they don't promote this as a recycled material. They don't say, hey, buy these swimming goggles, we use recycled plastic. The black specks that you see in the headband are because when they're injection molding the swimming goggles and they're making the black silicons around your nose and around your eyes, there are offcuts from that. They chop up those black offcuts from the silicon. And then when they're molding the red part for the head strap, they're blending, or they're just mixing the black in with the red. And not only do you get this really nice, interesting effect that gives decoration to a part of a product that never really had any decoration, but you use less virgin red silicon. So this is becoming much, much more important. And as I said, I really like this one because they don't scream and shout about this incredible innovation. It's just there. They had a factory that was producing that had offcuts and rubbish and waste, and they put that into the product. So I started this talk by asking you a question. Ask your materials what they want to be. What happens if you ask your materials how they can be transformed? I'd like you to think about another question just before I wrap up, because it's very easy for us to think about materials, as I hope you've understood from this talk, in terms of functional and choosing materials because they do the right thing. And, we put them at the beginning of the design process and we want to exploit them. But if you really want to think about the kind of emotive aspects of materials, which is much more complex, much more rewarding in terms of building stories for consumers, you have to understand that. So I want to leave you with this question, and it's an important question because whenever I've done workshops with students or with designers in big brands like BMW, as a kind of a warm-up or as a pre-workshop thing, I ask them to think about what their favorite material memory is from childhood. And having asked this question many, many times to people all over the world, one thing that is common in all of the answers is that the materials that people select are materials that changed the way they felt as children. No one has ever said, oh, I really remember the wood in my baseball bat because it was really strong and really tough. Or no one says, I really remember I had this little bicycle with, really stain resistant wheels, white wheels that never got dirty. It's always about, I remember finding a piece of chalk and drawing on a wall, and it made me feel like I wanted to be an artist. Or I remember finding a piece of wood and carving it up and thought how amazing it made me feel. And it's something that we never think about in terms of materials and how they make us feel. So think about this question, and I will leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. This has been really interesting as a lecture.
Yes, it has been. Thank you for sharing all these really wonderful examples of what materials are, what they can be actually. And I wanted to kick off the questions part with, from your perspective now, or from your experience that you've been working with materials for so long, how do you define what a successful material is? I guess it's a very open-ended question, but what's your definition of a successful material?
Yeah, great question. And I think particularly now, I mean, I would have said, I probably would have said this 10 years ago, that the material, a successful material is the one that is most appropriate for its use. How you define appropriate now has to be to do with the environment. And, I said before, when we think about sustainability in materials, we can think about it in different types of materials. So we can say, I have compostable materials, so materials that don't leave waste, and that can be salt water compostable as well. We can have materials that are endlessly recyclable. We can have materials that are made from, let's say, castor beans, or plastics made from castor beans, because they don't use any petroleum for the plastic. Or I can say, I've got pineapple leather because I don't have to use the tannins and the toxins to make, cowhide leather. The most appropriate are those that take those different approaches to sustainability and are tailored towards that product, because you cannot ask that question. You cannot apply the same material to, let's say, water bottles, disposable water bottles, as you can to a car part or a mobile phone, because what a consumer does with a water bottle is very different at the end of life to what a consumer does with, let's say, an iPhone or a car. And so compostability might be great for a water bottle because, there's a high chance, if you live anywhere near the sea, that it will end up in the sea. And so compostability might be the most important thing. But compostability for a car part, forget it, because there's so much rich material in there that I want to use it. I don't want to throw it away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so if I may ask another question, you ended your talk there with a very great question about, the strongest memory of when you were a child and what of a material. And you said a lot of that to do with the feeling that it made us, that shift in our childhood, kind of remembering that material. So if I may take you back to your childhood a little bit, and I want you to pick one craft, because you kind of touched on a material being a craft as well, and how that, how that is the spectrum.
Yeah.
In terms of, so I want you to pick one craft, and I want you to pick one material. At the timeline when you were a child, you can pick an age that is best for you, and I want you to kind of give us an ideal imaginary world of a creation that you would come up with today.
Sorry, it's just the last part of the question again. What was the last part?
So if you were to take one craft and one material, and you would marry those to come up with an object today, what would that be?
Oh, I see.
In an ideal world, forget all the sustainability, forget everything that is, doom and gloom today. But
yeah, great question. Really good question. I'll give you two examples, and as I'm giving you those examples, I'll think about how I would apply them today. So, two memories of materials. One is, I guess when I was around 10 or 11, and in my parents' garage there was a piece of wood. Lots of pieces of wood, and I with very crude tools, and my father didn't have woodworking tools, very crude tools, made a wooden aeroplane, and that was the first thing I ever remember making. That was, had some kind of, functionality as a toy, for example. The second thing, material memory from childhood, is when I must have been around 3 or 4, and I do remember very distinctly being in, at home with my parents in the garden, and they had quite a big garden and lots of earth. And I remember having a bucket and some earth and some water and mixing it with grass and bits of weed and bits of plant, and, just taking a bit of this and a bit of that. And then I emptied it, and out came this creature, and I thought I'd invented life, because I thought I'd made a creature. So if I were to think about those today, I mean, the creature thing I think is actually quite interesting, because one of the biggest areas of material innovation actually is in grown materials, and bacteria being part of that process to grow material, and particularly being led, I think, by the world of textile designers. I think in terms of the furniture, I mean, the furniture, all I can say is that I think wood is an incredible material. Wood is, but so not misunderstood, but for such a common thing, it is so lacking in real understanding of what this wood does versus this wood, and when this is a good wood to use because it's light or stiff or has good low friction because you want to use it in a drawer. And I would love to retire and become a carpenter. I don't know if that answered your question, but
well, I'm gonna pivot around that question, and I'm gonna kind of say, if you were to create this, if you're in this imaginary world, and we'll keep you there for a bit, yeah, we'll keep you there for a bit, and you would create with the one craft, with the one material, you would have to create an object. What would the object be? And it's free for all, this one. And who would you gift it to?
Oh gosh. If I had to make an object,
it would now, because you've committed to it.
Yeah, it's true. All right, two things again. Going back to the wood, something, because we have the Queen's Jubilee now this year, and one of the things that she's doing is she's promoting. She has this program, I forget what it's called, Green Canopy, which is about people planting trees. I have a particular love of trees. I would to mix my kind of growing things, I would if I had time, so we're imaginary, right? So I would plant the tree, I would make it grow, and then I would take branches from that tree and I would make a piece of furniture, and I would probably make a chair, and I would probably gift it to my wife, because I'm a romantic.
Your wife will be very happy.
And as I said, I love making things out of wood. I'm not very good. Don't get the wrong idea. I'm not very good at all. But I love the smell of wood. I love the texture of it. I love the way that it changes when you plane it, and feels with a piece of a steel tool against it. Yeah. So.
You've mentioned in your presentation a lot the word indulgence. I kind of, as an experience, right? Like as a kind of the output of a multiplicity of textures, of materials, and that experience is indulgent. Can you just kind of indulge us with a little more explanation with regards to that specifically? Like, does it only involve a multiplicity of materials? Like what are we looking at in terms of like experiencing these materials?
I think the indulgence of a story, I think, is important, because you have to explain why something is good, because we use things and we don't know, for example, why natural fibers are better on our bodies for certain reasons, any number of different reasons, compared to man-made fibers. So that indulgence, for me, I feel indulgence when somebody tells me, this particular fabric is really good at keeping you warm because of the way that the fibers are lined up, or repels water because it has a natural greasiness to it. That story, for me, I love, and I love telling that story. That's part of the reason why I really enjoyed writing those books, because I would find stories and indulging in that sense of luxury. For me, it is a sense of luxury, understanding why something is made. And then yes, or for example, so that's one example. Actually, the use of something in that indulgent part, I think the car interior is one of the most indulgent spaces you can be in, because you have everything. You have touch. You have a very kind of intimate contact with the steering wheel. I'm touching it, right? It's this close to my face. I smell things, the sound of everything. When I open the door, it's a different experience to when I'm, touching a button or touching a piece of glass. Now, if you have a, contemporary car, and that, I'm using a car example, but let me use. So I think that is a good example of indulgence. But if I were to talk about, let me think. A wallet is a. I'm trying to think of something a little bit more sophisticated than wallet. But I have a wallet that is. I've had it now for 2-3 years. It's becoming slightly shaped. It's becoming slightly stained. But indulging in that kind of change, and the feel of it, and taking it out of my pocket, to me is an indulgence. It's an unconscious indulgence. I don't think every time, oh, I have a lovely wallet, but I do. It kind of seeps into me. So two things. I think I think the knowledge is very much a part of some of that, and we've lost. We don't know why things are made from certain things. We have to be told.
It kind of refers to like being completely immersed in an experience of material, whether it's singular or it's collective.
Sure.
And I wonder if that immersion is not critical. Like I'm thinking like from a sinister kind of perspective, in terms of like this indulgence in luxury. Is it just limited to a certain kind of people living a certain lifestyle? You know what I mean? Like, how accessible is this indulgence in a general sense?
You can look at it like that. You can look at it in terms of luxury being indulgence. Yes, absolutely. But you can also look at it in terms of, a craftsperson with a particular tool, and the functionality of that tool woodwork tools. Sorry, I keep going on about woodwork, but that to me is an indulgence. And but it doesn't, luxury doesn't have to be equated with cost. It is because that's how we've come to perceive it. But luxury can be just how you value something, right? But that kind of connection with that object has to be controlled. Coffee is indulgent, right? In the right context, coffee is very indulgent. It's partly why coffees cost so much money, because we see them as indulgences. So that, yeah. I can't think of a good example of a low value indulgence, but there are. I'm certain of it.
If I just want to say, if anyone, there's Farah who has her hand raised, so maybe she has a question to ask.
Hello. Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for the presentation.
You're welcome.
I do have a small question that I wanted to ask you. Have you ever worked with a product that is used in buildings or temporary structures or architecture? And if you have used one, which one would you recommend that should be now widely used because it's more sustainable or environmentally friendly?
Specifically for that kind of application?
For interior or exterior, but mainly for buildings, not as a product, but for spaces.
Yeah, that's a challenging one because it's not such an area that I work very much in. I'm trying to think of something. I'm also not very good at thinking on the spot. But there was something that I saw recently.
Or something that can be used, like a product that you've worked with that can be reused in spaces.
I think there are lots of companies who take waste, plastic waste, and they reform it into panels that are used in interiors for wall cladding, for furniture, which I think are quite exciting. It's not particularly new. I mean, that's one of the first kind of materials in terms of sustainability that came out. Yeah, I mean, no, sorry, not just because I can't think on the spot. You give me 10 minutes and it'll come to me, because there was something I saw yesterday, but I just can't recall what it was. I saw it on Design.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, it'll come to me in 5 minutes when somebody else asks me another question.
Does anyone have any other questions?
So I might jump in and ask a question if nobody's asking a question. And I mean, it's not a specific question, but just more of your general comment on this. So I wanted to talk about the material sustainability and consumption. So this trio that we have today, because you kind of touched on, the idea of indulgence, because if you have indulgence, that implies that we have abundance. But in today's world, that's not received very well if we say that we have an abundance, especially with materials, if we're looking at the context of sustainability there. So how do you see this trio working in terms of, which camp are you in? Or which camp do you, in terms of a spectrum, do you go between? Are you quite optimistic in terms of the abundance of material that we have, or are you quite pessimistic in terms of that we need to reduce the consumption?
No, I mean, for sure we need to reduce consumption, but I think that's going to be that's a hard challenge. I think the optimism I see from companies that want to change very, very quickly, to the point where, I had one call with a client the end of last year, and they said that they have been told they have to be carbon neutral across the whole organization by the end of 2022, which is like crazy in terms of an expectation to do that. I think the idea of materials reuse, circularity, rejuvenated, I think is probably the one where we have the most control, not control over, yes, I mean, maybe more control, because you're not trying to develop something new. I mean, the materials that we have already, the plastics, for example, or I've talked about plastics, but let's talk about, the food industry, and let's talk about the waste from chickens. And there was some research that was being done in Australia by a group called CSIRO that looked into chicken waste, chicken and food, and taking feathers, because there's something like 6 million chickens that are consumed every day in North America by one company. You imagine how many feathers there are, and then taking the feathers and utilizing that and extracting the protein to make plastics. I think this idea that the waste, redefining waste, because I mean, waste is negative, right? I mean, waste is just rubbish, but there is good and there is bad waste, and making sure that there is no bad waste, which means that everything can be reused. I think that's probably it's the one that's also in that designers can kind of own to some degree, and there are a lot of those kinds of waste projects that have started from designers observing, and innovating. That to me, I think, is probably the most interesting area and the one that I'm most optimistic about.
And if sorry, if I just may, I must add one more question. It's about, I think, also with this material innovation and material development that that globally that we're going through. I think it's so important as well that we educate the market, we educate the consumer in that sense.
Absolutely.
I mean, what sort of tools do you think that might be quite powerful now, in addition to the social media, in addition to kind of doing these sorts of talks, and that we can educate the masses in that sense about material importance?
I think that there are different strategies. I mean, one strategy is the sense of education, and I think people being conscious of their responsibility. And I think one of the most important, I guess, things that happened in that area was, I think, a global initiative, which was to remove plastic bags from supermarkets, which in this country is, quite significantly, a lot of traction, and not because it reduces the amount of plastic either as waste or the oil used to make a plastic bag, but because every time, because I think, a plastic bag in terms of global production of plastics is quite small. I don't know, but I'm just going to guess. But because, we're talking about grams. Now, that the value in that was an educational value, because every time a consumer went into any supermarket, and several years ago, it was, would you like a plastic bag? That's where it started. Would you like a plastic bag? And then it became, well, if you want a plastic bag, you have to pay. And now it's like, if you want a plastic bag, it's going to cost you a lot of money. Now, that's not telling people, the value of certain materials. That's just reminding people to be better consumers and actually to be thoughtful of it. And that was the most important aspect of that whole initiative of removing plastic bags. There is another side, which is that, and it was something that I heard on, it was a podcast, and I'm really sorry that I don't remember the person who did the podcast, but it was to do with the psychology of sustainability. And he was saying that he was comparing having solar panels on your roof and saying, it's an added cost and it looks ugly, et cetera, et cetera. So rather than it being a chore, and rather than it being presented to people as something they had to do because, we should feel guilty if we don't do it, present these kinds of opportunities as positives. So yeah, sure, it's more expensive, and sure, it might look ugly, but guess what? You can have a disco in every room, he said. And it's like, it's turning it into something positive. And I think these stories that I've highlighted, for example, the shoe made out of grape skin. I mean, I'm a consumer. I like going shopping. I would probably, and I don't think I'm particularly unusual in this, I'd probably spend a little bit more money on that because it's an incredible, I'd rather own that, I mean, it's like, oh, it's a grape skin shoe than the, let's say, the leather or the traditional plastic. So it's that kind of premiumizing of products that have a much better CO2 footprint, and the psychology of engaging people through almost like the back door. Don't buy it because you should feel less guilty buying this, but actually buy it because it's amazing, and what it's going to do for you, I think, is more powerful than the guilt. Because it's a very difficult thing to educate people on. I mean, it is so complex. It is so complex that, I mean, even just the triangle on the back of the recycling triangle, which has numbers 1 to 7, no one knows what those numbers mean. No one. I mean, you could have 1% of the population would be, I'd be surprised if they knew what those numbers meant. So, that kind of eligible education doesn't work. But I think what we have to have is people keeping these big corporations on their toes and saying, you know what, you said this, it's completely wrong, or you're lying. And it keeps them on their toes. Otherwise, they could get away with murder. But I think it's very difficult for the man on the street to, like I said, like I highlighted with the tote, the cotton tote bag versus the plastic bag. I mean, cotton's a terrible material. It's full of pesticides, use of water, and so. But ask people on the street, again, no one would know that. Very few people. So it's a hard one to educate in that respect. I think you have to play a little psychology.
Yeah.
So I've been trying to kind of visualize how because you showed this graph and you showed us some images from your studio with the different materials on the table. So I'm kind of trying to visualize how on like a day-to-day base, when you're starting off a new project, how you physically interact in this process. So basically, do you like walk towards the table with the different materials and then you decide on one and then you're like, okay, this is what I'm gonna try today?
Yes, I mean, if we're developing products based on materials, then we will start with going through all of the drawers of many samples, and just picking out things that could relate to the project, and then we'll start playing with them on the table. We have a big central table, and we'll start putting this with that. We'll start cutting out. I mean, we did a project recently for technology. I can't say what it is, but technology is a square rectangle, right? If it's a laptop, if it's a phone, it's a computer, it's generally a rectangle. So we cut out a rectangle and a piece of paper and started to put that over this material with this, so you can get a sense of what the proportions could look like, and start putting light behind it, or starting to put graphics over it, and actually just playing with these samples. They have no resemblance to the product, but it's just saying what happens if, and it's fun. It's the most interesting part when we do those kinds of projects. And even if it's a technology material, let's say it's a smart material, there are ways that you can explore those materials with, let's say, things that are not necessarily that technology, but kind of replicate the effect. So we have a cutter in the office which cuts paper and fabric so that we can start to pull things and stretch them and see what they do. Not so much 3D printing. We occasionally use 3D printing, but not as a creative tool. The plotter is more relevant for that.
So with your last point with regards to like this idea of sustainability and kind of like identifying materials waste that then could be used, it kind of presents a layer to that experimenting or experience with materials, which is kind of identifying an abundance of waste somewhere. Sure. Then that kind of takes you into the experimentation.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So not really kind of being presented with a table of all these materials and thinking, oh, what would I like to work with?
Yes, but that's slightly different because we're the clients that we're working with, we are generally dealing with products that will be on the market in 3 years. And if you go back to that waste, and if you start to identify sources of waste, sure, you can do that as a creative process, but to actually get from that to something that can be used in a product in anything like the right amount of time is very challenging. I mean, because you have to have the supply chain set up, and even with big global producers of materials, to get them onboarded with, let's say, the brand owner can take a year. That's just to set them up. So that's before you've even got to before you even started this kind of research. I mean, I'd love to have that opportunity to identify sources of waste and start materials, but I think that's probably much more in the hands of students. I think definitely these are the most inspiring, projects. I mean, I can think of three. The one was the pineapple leather. That was a student. One was orange peel. I think it was orange peel to turn into plastic. The apple leather. No, the apple leather was somebody else. Sorry, just two. But there are multiple.
Mm.
But it comes to that idea of new. I mean, we have to present new, but at the same time, new, but that's real now. Which is why that diagram is very important for us, because we can't have the totally new unless we're doing research into technologies that are 5 years away and applications 5 years away.
But I think you kind of also define new in an interesting way that I would like to highlight, which is basically new could be in the way we process. I think you use the word process so much
absolutely.
That I think is really important to kind of bring back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we have bubble wrap, right? Bubble wrap is it's kind of horrible because it's annoying to get rid of, and it's plastic and it just travels around the world protecting things. But, if you can form, let's say, potato starch, that's another packing material, right? Potato starch that's water soluble, compostable. So, don't have to worry about throwing, air away, basically, because bubble wrap is air.
Guys, if you have any questions, the audience, if you have any questions, please ask away. Just unmute your mic and ask. We've only got about 8 or 10 minutes left of the talk, so
Totally.
use this time very preciously.
Oh, Rima has a question. Go ahead, Rima.
Sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. Because last time I was unable to unmute. So I actually had a question in regards to shifting our mentality from things that are very refined and sort of done in a very neat way to materials that now people are saying we actually need to find things within the environment or around us that, for example, if we're trying to recycle tiles or if we're trying to recycle types of plastic or metal into tiles and they look aesthetically in a specific way.
Yeah.
And actually that we need to sort of not accept that, but we should maybe shift our mentality towards accepting that sort of aesthetic. What would your thoughts be on that? Because there are a lot of materials, such as you were talking about food waste leathers that students were exploring. And I think one of the beautiful things about that is that they actually hold true to maybe the color. Sometimes you would notice that it have bits and pieces of what the material used to be before it became the final product. So like, what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I think that it's up to the brand owners to change that perception, to be bold enough to say, you know what, consumers will accept imperfection. They will accept a difference in color, color variation, because, I mean, I think that we have become accustomed. I'm 100% sure that most consumers wouldn't care less if. And let's talk about packaging. There was a very good example of packaging in this example. There's a British supermarket that started to use recycled plastic for their packaging of meat, I think, ready meals. So they come in a plastic carton, with a cardboard, wrap. And they started to use recycled plastic for the plastic carton. And what it meant was they couldn't ensure that the color of the plastic was the same for every item. So you had slight variations. I mean, pinks or blues or greens or whatever. But I thought that was a really bold move because, I mean, tell people that it's good for the planet, and they're not going to say, "Oh, I don't want this piece of plastic. I don't want my food in this piece of plastic because, it looks different to the the piece of beef next to it, or the chicken next to it, right? I mean, you know, and that's a very good, great example. I think those examples that I showed you of the swimming goggle and the phone case, I think are also very good examples. That has become a fashion accessory. I mean, that's a trend, that speckle effect, but it is imperfection. It is waste. I think Dyson give a very good example. I mean, it's slightly contentious, but you know, when you can see flow lines in plastic, it's because the plastic hasn't kind of homogenized in the tool, and that can make it look slightly imperfect. But you know, James Dyson has been selling vacuum cleaners for the last I don't know how many years, and they all look like that, but no one really cares. So I think that you're right, absolutely needs to change. That perception of what is acceptable needs to change, and even turning those kinds of imperfections into you know, higher value things. Because what's craft? I mean, craft is everything's different, right? I mean, I don't want to buy the same thing as everybody else. I want something to be made for me.
But that also ties into your point with regards to like how we tell the story and how we twist it into a positive narrative.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah. I mean, you know, you buy a luxury car. I mean, it's not so much on trend now, you know, wood inside a luxury car. And they always say, you know, the wood's going to be different when you place your order for your luxury car. They'll say, we can't guarantee that you're going to get exactly this wood. It's like, yeah, sure, I understand, because it's a piece of wood, right? It's an education. It's kind of, people don't care. I think brands care, are more worried, you know, just be bold and say, you know, we need to do this.
If I may ask one question, we kind of talked about emotions in design in general and product design. You know, you can use emotions to, you know, use the sensory idea, you know, like you gave an example of the car as well. There's the tactile, you know, kind of, there's the touch, there's the smell, the sight, you know, even the way that, you know, sometimes the door closes, you know, these things are very, very important you know, just for us as consumers in general. But materials and products are very time relative. So what is, and I'm going to ask this question to you and Chris, and also to the audience. Please feel free to unmute your mic and chip in. We'll kind of have an open, you know, an open-ended sort of question for everybody. But what would you guys say, in your opinion, is the material of our time today? You know, given that the world is filled and very charged emotionally at the moment, whether it's, you know, the pandemic, whether it's politically, whether it's settlement and securities in the world, whether it's material scarcity or abundance. So there's obviously a lot of emotions that are going on there that we can draw from. So what would be the material of our time today if we are living in this crazy time, I may say as well?
I think without a doubt is plastic.
Right.
For so many reasons. It still dominates. It dominates everything. I mean, maybe steel, but I think steel is quite restricted to certain things, whereas plastic, it's prolific. It's everywhere. It's from buildings that last 30 years to water bottles and coffee cups that last 30 seconds. You know, it is going through a monumental change. Sorry, that's a boring answer. You thought I was going to say something really cool, like this is plastic made from.
Because plastic does come under attack quite a lot, you know, as soon as you mention anything to do with sustainability.
Yeah.
But I mean, unless we stop plastic production, plastic consumption will always continue.
It will continue. It will continue because the world won't work without plastic. It just won't work. We have to find different ways of using it and different, you know, sources for it, like, you know, that isn't fossil based.
I mean, our bodies now have plastic in them.
Unfortunately, they do. Unfortunately, they do.
There are some percentage plastic.
Yeah.
Oh, Rima says we are nearing a biological age, I think, as Neri Oxman states.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I do agree with that one. I do. I don't, but my world is from the commercial world of the now, and that's still a way off, I think. It's still a way off. I mean, yes, I would still say that's a way off in terms of entering mainstream. I'm very sorry. I have to I have to cut it because I actually have a call. That,
Yes, no problem.
I'd love to have carried on.
I mean, we've kind of asked a lot of questions, so hopefully the participants have. I think the participants, yeah, I think we're fine. We didn't get any questions from the participants. So thank you so much, Chris.
My pleasure.
For joining us for this Tashkeel lecture, and also for a fascinating session. We have learned so much. For more information, please visit chrislefteri.com. And for more on Tashkeel, follow us at Tashkeel Studio and at tashkeel.org, where you will find lots more talks, lectures, and workshops to join. Again, thank you, Chris, for this really interesting, engaging lecture. Yeah. Hopefully we see you in Dubai, in the sun somewhere.
Hopefully one day.
And please keep in touch. Update us on your news and the new materials you're working with. And see you next time.
Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.